Depression. It's a mood, it's a state of mind, sometimes it's a sickness. Mankind has lived with it since the beginning of recorded history. King Saul suffered from severe depression. So did Abe Lincoln, who was so afraid of his melancholy, he refused to carry a gun for fear he'd shoot himself. Edgar Allan Poe was a depressive, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Winston Churchill, who called it his black dog. Another side of the disease, manic depression, has been shared by as diverse personalities as Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the ancient Babylonians, and Josh Logan, one of the kings of Broadway. Today, an estimated 19 million Americans are suffering from depressive disorders. But most of us don't know depression in those terribly destructive forms. Sadness, grief, simple depression, they're the things we feel, the things we have to deal with, the things that cause us pain. But the fact of the matter is that we're all linked together by our emotions. Nebuchadnezzar, Abe Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and me, and you too. All of us who, in our own way, are living with and coping pretty well most of the time with our emotions. What we know about them, what the experts are learning about how to handle them when they get out of hand, and how you can become more effective at living with yourself is our story. I'm David Prowett, and tonight we'll look at depression, the Shadowed Valley, a place we've all visited and where too many of us have remained after sliding over the thin edge. For centuries, man has been trying to understand, cope with, and train his emotions. For a long time, we couldn't even find them. So love was from the heart, anger in the spleen, and well-being in the stomach. Finally, after centuries of looking around for the seat of all these powerful, strange, and sometimes frightening feelings, we settled on the head as our emotional home. Phrenology became big business for a while. For a fee, you could have your head felt and be told about your character and your emotional potential for destruction, spirituality, even your connectedness, whatever that means. Then Freud, psychoanalytic theory, and the beginnings of analysis and psychotherapy. And then quite recently, we developed the skills to begin studying the brain and got the first vague glimmerings of where the mind and emotions really live. And that's pretty much where we are today, at the beginning. The success story to date is in the treatment of depression, the disease of depression that affects millions of people in the U.S. alone. Depression is a word we use to encompass a wide variety of conditions, from sadness to the real illnesses of manic depression and clinical depression. We can diagnose them, we now have chemical and other treatments to cure them, and we have ways to help prevent their recurrence. The first real theoretical look at depression was a psychoanalytic one, an attempt to define the condition. One constant was always present, that depression always involves loss. Loss of someone close through death or separation, loss of self-esteem, loss of a value system, or loss of others' esteem. A totally mind-oriented view, which obviously called for a mental treatment. In this case, long-term analysis. A search for the long-buried maladjustment that caused the depression. Then, various types of psychotherapy began to appear, using a whole variety of short-term treatments to try to help the various types of depressives. Both views were based on the assumption that depression was a problem of the mind, not the body, and treatable by therapy alone. But they didn't work often enough or fast enough. About the only other type of treatment available then was electroconvulsive therapy, shock treatment. And that was so primitive at the time that the cure really could be worse than the disease. Then, in the 1950s, the real breakthrough in treating the two most serious depressive diseases occurred. Researchers found that people suffering from severe depressive illness showed several biochemical changes in their bodies. The hormones put out by certain glands, particularly the pituitary and adrenals, became imbalanced. So did microscopically small amounts of chemicals in the brain called amines, along with electrolytes, our body salts. And they found drugs that could restore the normal balance of these systems. And when they did, the depressions vanished. Today, biological research into the causes and cures of mental illness is just beginning. And one of the most fascinating areas being studied is genetics, where scientists are finding indications of a possible link between our genetic makeup and our susceptibility to depressive disease. Dr. William Bunny Jr., chief of the adult psychiatry branch at the National Institute of Mental Health, has been working on the new biochemical and genetic factors in mental illness.
And there's a great deal of evidence that there are genetic factors in affective illness. If you have a pair of identical twins and one of them develops a severe depressive illness, the likelihood is about 60 to 80% that the other twin will develop the same illness. While if you have non-identical twins, then the likelihood is somewhere around 15%. So there is evidence for a genetic factor. If one individual in a family has depression, there's a likelihood that somebody else in the family will also have it, a much higher incidence than in the normal population. Now, the second possible cause of depression or factor in depression is what I'm calling a biological one. And a biological dysfunction or even biological defect could be acquired in utero, could be acquired at birth, could be acquired environmentally, or could be acquired genetically. But some of the evidence for a biological factor is that these illnesses can be reversed with drugs.
There you are, at last.
Cold buns and cold ham.
And the drugs are working. For Betty Hamilton of Charleston, West Virginia, the nightmare of severe depression began without warning in her late 30s. Then, suddenly, she and her family were in a crisis without even knowing what was wrong. How did she feel? Well, this is her story.
Come on, Sam. Well, it had really happened very quickly, and I began not to be able to manage as far as doing the kinds of things that I really had always been able to do easily, such as cook, wash, take care of the children, play games, do that kind of thing. One of the most, I think that one of the most frightening aspects at the beginning was that time went so slowly. It would seem sometimes that at least an hour had gone by, and I would look at my watch, and it had only been 3 minutes. And I began not to be able to concentrate. It was another thing that was very frightening to me was that I couldn't read anymore. And if I awakened earlier than I needed to, I sometimes would lie in bed 2 hours trying to make myself get up because I just couldn't put my feet on the floor. Then when I did, I just felt that I couldn't get dressed. And then whatever the next step was, I felt that I couldn't do that. There is such a terrible nothingness. There's no beauty, there's no love, there's no hope, there's no joy. And the only thing that there is a terrible fear and an awful desire to die. You absolutely know that you're never going to be well. You feel that anything that you might be able to do that's going to help you get rid of the depression for even a half hour would be worth it. So I tried drinking for a while. It was a very unsuccessful thing for me to do, and I'm sure that it was very hurtful to the family.
Well, I didn't understand it, and I still don't. And you give it a lot of thought, but you know you will never fully understand it unless you've been there. And, I think I was patient. I tried to be nice to her, but of course the minute I left her, and I don't think I ever did tell her this, why I'd go around the corner and cuss like mad. But I think if it hadn't been for the children, I think I would have climbed the walls and maybe done like a lot of people do and just say, I'm leaving.
When I'd wake up in the morning, I'd go downstairs and she'd be in bed, and I'd come home from school and she'd be in bed with the Coke sitting beside her watching TV or just laying there or something.
Like when we used to just say the littlest thing, and she never got angry. She'd just start crying and just walk away, and that's the stuff I remember. And
You would look around at me and say, what did I say?
I know, that was...
It's hell when you don't have to die to go to hell. All you have to do is to be depressed. I really felt that I had no alternative except to get some psychiatric help, which I did. And I was probably the world's worst psychiatric patient, wasn't I, Paul?
I'd say.
I hated it. I really felt that it didn't have any serious problems, that that I couldn't deal with. The only thing that I had the problem with was depression. But he would say, you don't think you're going to take a pill that's going to change your personality? And I kept saying, I don't want to change my personality. You know, I really kind of like myself the way I am. Don't say anything. But I just want to get rid of the depression. Well, in the midst of the third depression, you remember the day I called you at the office and said, you've got to come home, because it was the first time, I guess, that I really knew that I was going to commit suicide. It wasn't, I mean, even the allegiance that I felt to you all was not strong enough to keep me from taking my life, but I just felt I couldn't face this depression any longer. So your dad and I went to New York, and they started me on antidepressants and then eventually on lithium, which has been over 4 years ago, and I really, you know, have not had any problems since that time. So almost every time I take a lithium tablet, I say, here goes a miracle.
The use of antidepressant drugs and the continuing maintenance dose of lithium, two biochemical weapons only available in the last few years. Lithium deserves more explanation. It is sometimes used in treating severe depression, but in its very short history, it's been the specific treatment for manic depression, a tremendously destructive mental illness that affects 5 to 10 million Americans. Dr. Ronald Phoebe, Chief of Psychiatric Research and Director of the Lithium Clinic at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, is an expert in the use of the drug.
Manic depression usually starts in the mid-20s, and it goes on as a recurrent mood disorder throughout the person's lifetime, up into the 70s and the 80s in some instances. It may occur as frequently as every other month, and it may occur as infrequently as every 5 or 10 years. The most common form of mood disorder, I would say, occurs with someone who has a high, maybe once a year, followed by a depression. The high is usually 1 to 3 months in length. The depression is anywhere from 1 to 6 months. And many of our creative and productive people in the society, in fact, function more effectively on a little high. It's when the high goes out of control and actual psychosis and poor judgment is exercised that the problems begin. Marital conflicts. It's not uncommon for a manic patient to have a history of 4 or 5 divorces. Each time he's gotten into a high, he decides to shed his wife, for instance. It's not uncommon to find people that have tremendous business losses, having been caused by poor judgment and overextension of oneself during the business life. To prevent their future highs and lows, let me show you here. I have a bottle of lithium capsules. These are 300 milligram size capsules that patients take, usually 3 to 4 times a day. Lithium is a simple, naturally occurring element in the ground. It's one of the basic elements in nature. The interesting thing about this element is that lithium is the first specific prophylactic treatment ever to come about in the field of psychiatry. It prevents the recurrence of a major mental disease, manic depression. The patient has to take 3 or 4 capsules a day, but it's important that the patient comes back for blood monitoring. A blood test has to be taken from the serum maybe once a month to determine the lithium level. So its effect on recurrent mood disorders is not unlike that of insulin's effect on diabetes. In other words, the patient, to remain well, has to continue taking a maintenance treatment, and in most instances, for his entire life. They have their mood and past month's behavior rated by trained nurses that use rating scales. If there are any particular problems in the family, in addition to their basic mood disorder, which is maintained normal 80–85% of the time, and if any particular additional problems come about that they want to talk over with the psychiatrist, they are usually able to see a psychiatrist, or they're referred outside the lithium clinic to what we call a talking psychiatrist, because we are more interested in the application of drugs and biochemical treatments. Basically, less than 5% of our entire population requires any form of additional talking or psychotherapeutic treatment.
As Dr. Phoebe points out, two of the real problems in using mind drugs are these. First, at the beginning of treatment, to see if the specific drug you're using is the most effective one for the patient's condition. Then, finding out what the proper dosage is for each individual patient. In many cases, it might take as much as 2 to 3 weeks to find out whether a drug or its dosage is having any real effect. That's 2 to 3 weeks with the patient still suffering, often away from work, often straining financial resources, and no guarantee that this particular drug treatment is the proper one. And the really tough part is that there are no measuring devices the doctor can use to tell if he's on the right track until the patient just tells him he's feeling better. Dr. Gary Schwartz, director of the Psychophysiology Laboratory at the Eric Lindemann Mental Health Center in Boston, may have come up with a way to shorten that painful search period. If our eyes are mirrors of our souls, our face is the telegraph of our emotions. Often, even without our realizing it, the set and motion of our faces reflect our happiness, sadness, fear, anxiety. It's easy to read these broad expressions, even in total strangers.
Okay, Louise, would you give us a really large happy face? Make a big happy face and hold it.
Impulses from the electrodes monitoring several muscles on Louise's face clearly indicate the smile.
What I'd like you to do now is to give us a great big sad face.
But what Dr. Schwartz is finding out is that those muscles react to our innermost thoughts, even when we can't see the changes. You can see, Louise's face doesn't change outwardly, but the electrical impulses of the tiny muscles being monitored are telling the story of her inner-induced unhappiness. As people become either less unhappy or more happy, both the intensity and the pattern of these impulses change. For a depressed patient under beginning drug therapy, a simple set of questions asked at certain intervals could reveal whether the treatment is working long before the patient is aware of it, and cut long days out of the search for proper medication. Unfortunately, the time factor in drug therapy is there. It takes time to find the drug, time for it to take effect, time for it to stabilize the patient, time to evaluate possible side effects. But if you're severely depressed or possibly pre-suicidal, there may not be that much time to wait for help. There's an old treatment for depression that works. It fell into disfavor some years ago, but now, with new research, it's being reappraised. Dr. Max Fink, professor of psychiatry at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, explains how it works.
Convulsive therapy, which is also known as shock therapy, is the most effective treatment that we have for severe cases of depression, particularly those who are suicidal or those who have been ill repeatedly. In such cases of severe depression, the success rate, that is the number of patients that can be helped, is very high. In many studies, the rate of improvement or the rate of cure is measured as 80 to 90% of the patients treated. We now believe that there are biochemical changes in the brain which have occurred, and the manifestation is the depression or depressive illness. Psychiatrists throughout the world have studied the biochemistry of depression for the past few decades. One of the consequences of giving a patient convulsive therapy is that there are systematic changes in the brain, biochemical changes, which can be measured by devices such as these. Brain change is a necessary part of the treatment process in convulsive therapy, as it is in drug therapy. The treatment was first introduced in the late 1930s. In the beginning, physicians did not know how to treat patients well, and so there were complications. Since then, we have learned how to give patients sedatives, muscle relaxants, and the treatment is a relatively simple and easy procedure for the patient.
Your reflexes are good.
the patient is checked by the physician to see if the proper degree of sleep and the proper degree of muscle relaxation has occurred.
No reflexes. None. No reflexes. Very good. She's getting unilateral treatment.
If everything is appropriate, then the electrodes are applied, an instrument is then turned on, and there is a current. This current is approximately 1 second. For the next 90 seconds, the patient has a convulsion, or has a seizure, as we call it. But what you see is very little. The only thing that is seen is there is some movement of the toes, and that's all. At the end of a minute, minute and a half, the physician will then put a mask on the patient's face, connected to an oxygen tank, and the patient is helped to breathe pure oxygen for perhaps 3, 4, or 5 minutes. When the patient spontaneously breathes again, and they do within about 2 minutes after the treatment, then the patient is allowed to sleep for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And if the treatment is given in an outpatient setting, the patient can go home in about 20 minutes to 30 minutes after the treatment. When treatments were first given, there were 3 major complications or major side effects. Fracture, which no longer occurs now that we have muscle relaxants. The fear of treatment no longer occurs because we have the anesthetics and sedatives. And the third is this loss of memory. Now, patients do have difficulty in memory, usually for a day to a day and a half after each treatment. After a course of treatment, this difficulty in recalling recent events may last a few weeks. The longest that has been measured in most studies is about 10 to 14 days. If you examine the patient, say 1 month later, this difficulty in recall has disappeared. Indeed, if one were to compare these 2 very effective treatments for depression, drug therapy is relatively easy to administer. The patient gives a prescription, the patient takes his medication. But the difficulties are that he must take his medicine every day, and it will take about 2 weeks. ECT is a treatment that has to be given by the physician, has to be given in a medical setting, and so it is difficult from that point of view. However, the treatment response is seen in the 3rd, 5th, or 7th day, and that is very important, particularly in suicidal cases.
While electroconvulsive therapy has definitely been making a comeback as a treatment for depressives, there are still a number of doctors in the mental health field who are worried about it. The chief disagreement doesn't appear to be whether it works or not, but what damage it does to the mind, particularly the memory. And there's another thing that you should know about the new treatments. Antidepressant drugs like imipramine and amitriptyline aren't uppers like amphetamines. Remember, the use of antidepressants is to get your chemistry back to normal. If you're there already, the drugs won't give you a lift. They won't give you anything. Secondly, if you're wondering what lithium will do if you just grab a handful to tide you over a grumpy morning, the answer is simple. It could kill you. The reason Dr. Phoebe was so careful about the continuing blood testing is that lithium is effective in a very small range. Too little in your body and it doesn't do its work. Too much is lethal. How can we tell if we're seriously depressed, in enough trouble to need these powerful treatments? Betty Hamilton described some of her symptoms. Here are a few other warning signs. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, loss of interest in sex, withdrawal from friends, relatives, society. Now, we've all felt some of these symptoms from time to time. The key to how serious a problem someone has is when the new behavior is a change from the normal. The second thing that indicates the seriousness of the problem is the length and severity of the symptom. If you miss a couple of nights of sleep because of a problem, or even a week or two, it doesn't indicate you're headed for a clinical depression. It means you've got a problem to solve. Other symptoms often involved in serious clinical depression are sadness, loss of concentration, a feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, and suicidal ideas. And speaking of suicide, if you've heard that old bromide that if somebody talks about suicide, they won't really do it, don't believe it. Most suicides talk about their plans, begging someone anyone to listen, to help ease their psychic pain. If no one does, that's when depression's victim can wind up as one of the more than 25,000 people that we know took their own lives in the U.S. last year. The actual number may be twice that. Some other information on suicides. About twice as many women as men try suicide, but 3 times as many men succeed. The reason? Difference in method, mostly. Men tend to shoot or hang themselves or jump out of windows, methods that once employed practically guarantee death. Women, on the other hand, tend towards slashed wrists and sleeping pills, both ways that take a relatively long time to become fatal and allow for the possibility of changing your mind. But here's our point. 75% of all people who attempt suicide are seriously depressed. And the tragedy is that so many of them could have been helped if we knew more about them. There are people trying to find the answers.
The questions always come. How can anyone really do it? How do they feel? Aren't they scared? Well, those are some of the questions Dr. Edwin Schneidman is trying to answer. He's professor of medical psychology at UCLA's Center for the Study of Life-Threatening Behavior.
I gave a workshop on suicide. At that workshop, a young woman approached me and spoke to me. She had done the most extraordinary thing. She had immolated herself, namely, she had burnt herself, almost to death. She miraculously survived because when her automobile exploded, when she ignited the match, there were other people around whom she had not known of, who came and rolled her on the ground and extinguished those awful flames. Some weeks later, she made this recording of what happened about 10 minutes before she set herself on fire.
I had an electric egg beater that I had to return to some friend's house, which was a few blocks away. So I got into the car and at the time took a jar, a gallon jug, and took it with me along with the egg beater. And I remember kind of shaking when I was getting the jug. I think I was a bit afraid. I was a bit nervous that I had made the decision. I was kind of scared, almost like I had to do it. It was something I was kind of forced into in a way. So I took the egg beater to these friends' house, and they were home. And I remember just walking through the house, and by this time I was sobbing again. And not one word was said to me by these people. I think there were around 4 people in the house. And I just walked through the house, put the egg beater on the kitchen table, and walked right out. And nobody said, "What's wrong?" At that time, I really must have been reaching out. I must have been saying, you know, I am really upset. I am really having problems. My car was parked out in front, and so I went down and got into the seat of the car, and I did take a book of matches with me. It seemed like I moved slowly at that time. It wasn't really a quick movement. I don't remember things going through my mind of even thinking of my sadness or things that were breaking my heart. It was going to be good. It was going to be perfect. It was going to be something that was going to fulfill me. I felt very calm. I felt kind of a hush over my body. And I remember then pouring the gasoline first over the front seat and myself, and then over the back seat. Even then, no thoughts went through my head at all of the pain that it was going to entail, the misery, the hurt, any of that. I don't know why. I didn't think that burns would really hurt. It felt good. It felt that it was the first time, in fact, that I had felt at peace. Well, I opened the matchbook and struck one match, and it would not light. It was soaked with gas, and I kind of sort of smiled to myself, thinking, well, you have to try a second one. And I remember very slowly striking the second one, and it did strike, and it did light. And at that second, it just tremendous ignition. It was overwhelming sound. It was just, the noise was very loud.
The fact that all she can see is what the suicidal act will do for her. She's fallen away from life. She's cut her ties to the world. She has no presentiment, no idea of the pain that burning will cause. And yet, before that and after her recovery, she was keenly aware of the other aspects of her life, all the reasons for her to live, all her ties to life. Let's talk for a moment about danger signs or clues to suicide. The giving away of prized possessions, the withdrawal from society, the changing of behavior. The person says, I won't be around, you won't be seeing me anymore, and overtly, if the person says, I'm going to kill myself, experience shows that contrary to the myth in this field, where people who talk about it don't do it, the facts are just the opposite. The people who do it are the people who've talked about it.
Who gets depressed? Well, a recent survey indicates that during any given year, about 15% of all adults between 18 and 74 may suffer significant depressive symptoms. Experts are also finding out that severe depression, long thought to be basically an illness of middle age or older, is appearing more and more frequently in young people. And depression doesn't have any color bars or socioeconomic class system. This ultimately democratic condition appears to hit all the divisions about the same way. But it does appear to have some sexist tendencies, striking almost twice as many women as men. Why? Well, that's one of the questions being asked by Dr. Myrna Weissman, assistant professor in psychiatry at Yale University.
Some people think it's genetic. Some people think it's hormonal, although there's not really good evidence for either one of these to explain all depressions in women. And of course, the other possibility that's a real one is because of women's role in society, and that's the possibility that's getting a lot of coverage these days. But, you know, if you look at all the figures that have been reported from all over the world, there's about 3 female depressives for every male who's coming for treatment. Now, we don't know whether that's because men don't come for treatment, or whether men do other things instead of get depressed or treat their depression by themselves, perhaps by drinking. One thing I've noticed in our clinic is that when we get men, they're often sicker. They come at a later stage of their illness than women. And it might be that they're just reluctant to come, and therefore they're probably a little bit harder to treat. The alcohol rate is much higher in men than in women. Alcohol is a depressant, and it's a very poor treatment for a clinical depression. It doesn't work.
We begin experiencing sadness over loss early in childhood. The phrasing may be different than adults, but the same feelings are there.
Once my aunt died, I was crying when she died, and it was sad. When I don't got no friends, and I'm lonely. Well, when my mommy separated from my father and when my granddaddy died. When my pet died, and I wish I still had him. When I think of somebody who moved or one of my grandparents who passed away, something like that.
And we begin developing our coping skills to handle these feelings.
I just go someplace where no one else is. I go to my mom and she cheers me up. I yell and scream. Go out and make friends with somebody, ask them to play with me. When I'm sad, I cry. It makes me feel better. It makes me feel better when I talk to somebody. Calm myself down, play some games. I usually tell my mother, she usually plays my favorite game with me or something. She makes me feel better usually. Well, what makes me happy whenever I do that stuff, well, I just forget about the whole thing.
But sometimes the coping skills don't work. Sometimes, just as in adults, things get out of hand, and professional help is needed. It's been just recently that childhood depression has been recognized. One of the pioneers in the area is child psychiatrist Leon Citron. He and his associate, Dr. Donald McNew, are conducting their studies at Children's Hospital National Medical Center in Washington, D.C.
Up till 1940s or 50s, depression was really regarded as a disease of adulthood, and nobody even assumed the presence of depression in children. In fact, most textbooks on child psychiatry didn't even mention childhood depression until the 1960s. Depression in children, we believe, does not manifest itself in most children in the same fashion as it does in adults, and it appears in a masked form. We call it the masked depression of childhood. We, of course, contemplated the use of drugs, the antidepressant drugs, in child depression. I must say that we really did not accumulate too much experience with these drugs, primarily because in most children we didn't find the need to use them. We found that the children responded very well to psychotherapy, to family counseling.
You know, how's it been going last year for you? How's life been for you?
Not so very good last year. I'm doing good this year. I think so.
So it's been pretty much this last year that things have been better for you.
Depression is often a family affair, where one member sows the seeds of depression in another. Genetic, biochemical, psychological, environmental. Probably a mix of two or more. But for 12-year-old Alan and his mother, the cause is far less important than the help brought by Dr. McNew in their regular psychotherapy sessions.
What do you think's made the biggest difference for Alan?
Well, I think because you say I was better, right? Right?
Yeah.
What do you notice different about your mother now, Al, from a couple of years ago?
She stopped talking those kind of ways that she said because last time she said that she was going to jump off buildings and everything like that, and that's what made me act just like that last year. It changed me a whole lot.
When you hear your mother talking about jumping off buildings, what kind of way does that make you feel?
Terrible.
Terrible. You'd be left all alone in the world? That must have been a terrible feeling, Al. Mrs. Brightwell, it would be helpful, I think, for me to know what was making you feel so badly and contributing to Al's feeling so sad and hopeless.
So my father died.
I guess that was the period after your father died. Yeah. Shortly, not too long after Gene had passed away, and then I just didn't care, I guess, what really happened to me, because I felt I had lost everything. I wasn't thinking about the children. I was being selfish.
If you can't take care of yourself, how can you take care of somebody else?
I pushed them away. I did that.
Al, you were saying at this time this made you feel sort of hopeless when you'd see her talking about hurting herself or going off bridges, stuff like that. What did it do to your functioning?
And she said that, and I thought that I wouldn't never see her again. And then that's what made me start all that just, see, that's why I stumble now.
That's why
I
what?
started it all.
Well, that's why you stammer now. Now, during the time you were feeling badly, you actually thought of hurting yourself too, didn't you?
I feel like stabbing myself one time. Going outside and stabbing myself. Because we got this big old butcher's knife downstairs. And I see, I started crying. Then I ran downstairs. But before I was going to do it, and someone came over me. And then I think they was trying to tell me not to do it or something.
And so you didn't really hurt yourself ever, but you had those thoughts. After you left the hospital, did those kind of thoughts start to go away of hurting yourself?
Yes.
Ms. Brightwell, could you briefly remind me again of the things that happened to you when you were a little girl that were very similar to what happened to Al at the same age?
Well, I was about 8 or 9. I had the measles, and they put me in this dark room with the shades drawn and everything. And nobody would come back to see me. So I got some ammonia, and I put it in a glass and I had some salt. So I told my sister when they would come back to bring me something to eat, you know, I said, if somebody doesn't come back here with me, I'm going to drink this. So that sort of scared them a little bit. So then they did. But when I was coming up around his age, I had very depressed moments because I had lost my mother at the age of 3 years old. My father, I didn't really know him.
Al, what I'd like to end our talk with is something we used to do in the hospital all the time. You remember that? I used to get you to draw a picture for me and then tell me a story about it. Would you do that now?
Yeah. Do you like pictures of birds?
You draw what you'd like to draw.
An eagle? I can draw a picture of an eagle.
You draw whatever you'd like to draw. Don't worry about what they want.
I'm going to draw a picture of a bird.
Tell me a story now about this beautiful bird you draw.
He just sitting in a tree while watching people having a picnic.
Bird sitting on the tree, he's watching these people having a picnic.
Yeah.
How does he feel about that?
He wishes he was a person too.
Where's his family?
He ain't got one. Because I think when a bird is big enough to fly, and then mother leaves him.
The mother leaves the bird, and they fly off on their own. So you think birds lead pretty lonely lives, do you?
Yeah. That's an exotic bird, and they're gonna get caught by bird catchers when they're up in the tree watching the picnic.
I see. The bird watchers are going to catch this bird because it's an exotic one. And what are they going to do with it then?
They're going to take it to the zoo.
Yeah, and what'll happen there?
And then he'll get better than he was. And then they got little trees and got all these, don't you know that little animal is the zoo in it, and it's a big house. And it got trees in it, make the birds feel at home.
A few years ago, the bird would have had some catastrophic ending. He not only would have envied the picnic, he would have fallen off the limb on his head and been carried off in a stretcher to the morgue. In this case, he was rescued by bird watchers who took him to a beautiful place where he could lead a better life. I think this for Al was the hospitalization. One, we see in Al a child who had a depressed mother, who had suicidal thoughts at the age of 9, exactly the same age at which he first had suicidal thoughts. Secondly, she had to push him aside because of her own troubles. And the third most important etiological feature that we know of is the acute loss of his father, suddenly, traumatically, unexpectedly. And this was really the straw that broke the camel's back. And if you could uncover the depression and treat it, and we know that it can be uncovered and it can be treated, you could make a major change in some of the public health features of what goes on with the children in our country. You hear on TV documentaries, you hear on newscasts all the time, what's happening to the youth of America? Everybody says they're acting so badly. Maybe they're not acting so badly. Maybe they're very depressed.
As Dr. Weissman points out, alcohol, the universal cure for ordinary depression, just doesn't work for the more serious kinds. And even for ordinary depression, where 1 or 2 drinks might make you feel better temporarily, if you keep on, that slight high you get after 1 or 2 can turn all too quickly into a new low after a few more. And of course, while you're facing the hangover, the original cause of your depression is still there. It's just worse. If you do have a problem with depression and you need help, you may have to wait a while for an appointment. The professional mental health field isn't very big. In the entire country, there are about 160,000 psychiatrists, psychologists, psychiatric social workers, and psychiatric nurses. And as for research, well, both the budgets and the number of people in that field are small, too. A comparison. In 1974, we spent about $568 million on cancer research, a disease that affects more than 1 million people each year. We spent $190 million on heart research, a condition that affects about 15 million people. And on depression, a disease that affects 19 million people, we spent $6 million. Comparing mental health research to building a spaceship isn't really too far-fetched, because where the researchers are going now is a realm far more mysterious than space. It's here, in this incredibly compact, indescribably complex bundle of 10 billion cells that work on electrochemical power and through some unknown transformation create what we call our minds and our emotions. And the trip isn't easy. You can't dissect a mind like you can a heart or a lung. And responsible researchers can't take a human being without mental problems and create them just for study purposes. So, how do we learn more about depression? Well, we try to find a brain as close to man's as possible and study the animal it belongs to.
The practice of using animal models in the study of illness is as old as research itself. One of the primary studies to find out more about the mechanisms of depression and how to improve treatment for humans is going on at the University of Wisconsin's Primate Research Laboratory. Dr. Stephen Sumi explains the work.
When we first separate infants from their mothers or peers, we get a reaction which we term protest, which is characterized by a great deal of activity and a lot of vocalization, crying, general unhappiness on the part of the animal. And after a few days, this subsides and the animal retreats, withdraws to a corner of the cage, becomes socially unresponsive, and it is this series of behaviors that we label depression. Again, the series is very similar to what you see in humans. You certainly can't ask an animal, are you depressed, and have him answer in kind. But we can tell by some of the behaviors that these animals exhibit. If it has been playing with friends in the past, it will stop playing, and the animal's behavior can certainly be picked up here. You have an animal that once was interacting rather happily with a lot of friends, and now it has stopped this activity and instead tends to withdraw to the corner of its home cage or its test environment and wrap itself up in a ball, hang on to its body in a self-clasping type of posture. And these behaviors you don't ordinarily see in normal animals or in animals who have not been put through these manipulations. Also, if you look at the animal's face, this is sort of a subjective evaluation, but the animals clearly look sad. They look like they haven't been sleeping well, and it is things of this sort that lead us to conclude that these animals are showing depressive reactions, because these are the sorts of symptoms and syndromes that you see in the human case. We have trained observers who sit and watch the animals behave in a number of situations. Their home cage situation, what we call a playroom situation, where they can interact with other monkeys in much freer and much wider premises than in their own home cages. And we are presently investigating a number of techniques, some of which are identical or very similar to procedures which are currently used in human therapy, some which are slightly different. One form that we've been using is a form of behavior therapy or peer therapy. And what we do here is take specifically chosen monkeys who are the same age or very similar in age to our depressed animals, but who exhibit peculiar forms of behavior. In this case, the animals that we pick are animals that are very active players, that initiate active social activity. And when we have these animals interact with our depressed animals, typically what happens is the depressed animal goes into a corner and tries to socially withdraw, and our monkey therapists, if you will, drag the animals out into the middle of the play area and essentially force them to interact, force them to play with one another. And when an animal is playing, it's very difficult for it to be depressed. What we find is that depressive behaviors gradually go away. We are looking presently at urine levels of certain metabolites, brain metabolites, and at blood levels and levels in the cerebrospinal fluid, as well as looking at brain tissue directly. And it is our goal to find out, using monkey subjects, the things which precipitate depressions in humans, the characteristics, both behavioral and biochemical, And then finally, and most importantly, we're interested in developing procedures which are effective at curing and releasing individuals from the stress of depression.
Rhesus monkeys exhibit many of the manifestations of sadness and ordinary depression that we do. Are they the same? Well, nobody really knows. But they do know that many primates appear to be depressed, and they also respond to treatments that work on humans. Another emotional set that we appear to share with other animals, including primates, is a sense of loss, such as that we call grief.
Grief represents a particular syndrome of depression in response to bereavement or the actual loss. But when someone dies who's important to us, like we have a total body shock, which is called the grief state, of which sadness is the main component. But there are other components to it as well. It's a medley of emotions in grief. There's guilt, sometimes there's anger. Why did this person leave me? Or why didn't he change before he left me? There may be fear, how will I get along without my spouse? There may be apprehension, and there's often a profound biological changes. Sleep is disturbed, appetite is decreased, bowels get constipated, sexual interest decreases. In the normal state of events, this peaks at about 6 weeks or 3 months, and by 1 year, 85% of people who are grieving are symptom-free. In that sense, grief is a normal, abnormal state, something like pregnancy.
But whether it's trying to understand more about pregnancy, normal grief, or abnormal depression, the problem of studying healthy human beings remains. You just can't create a laboratory situation which endangers a human life or a human psyche. And after all, monkeys aren't little furry men with tails. Their brains and their minds aren't the same as ours. So the findings we make in animals, particularly regarding behavior, have to be very carefully weighed and evaluated before the results can be applied to humans. And yet, animals are the best tools we have to work with at the moment. And using them, we've learned a lot, particularly about the disease of depression. But the mood of sadness and common depression is still with us and probably always will be and perhaps should be. After all, it's part of the way we cope with life. Our reaction to the non-clinical forms of depression, the indecision, the temporary withdrawal, give us a breathing space, a time out before facing whatever it is that caused the mood in the first place. It's also sometimes a warning signal that something's wrong in our lives, and we'd better find out what and do something about it. Dr. George Winokur, head of the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics Psychiatric Division, has some strong feelings about when people should seek out professional help.
All depressives who have a disease have a mood which is similar to the mood of depression that you have in unhappiness. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same mood. As a matter of fact, you will sometimes see patients who say, I feel depressed, and when you ask them, is your depression the same as when you were unhappy under certain circumstances in the past, they say, no, it's different. But in general, the moods are pretty similar, the mood of depression and the disease. But to make a diagnosis of a disease, you need more than just a mood. You need a set of symptoms. You need such symptoms as sleep disturbance, poor appetite, weight loss, suicidal ideas, trouble concentrating, that kind of thing. Now those, when you get all those symptoms together, essentially what they do is they form a cluster of symptoms which we then call a syndrome or a disease. The simple fact of being unhappy is not a disease. Everybody is unhappy. It's a common state of an individual. It happens frequently, and the way you deal with it is you talk to your wife about it, you talk to your minister about it, you talk to your friends about it. You don't see a doctor because you're unhappy. That's absurd. You would keep doctors busy constantly under those circumstances. You see a doctor when you have a syndrome of depression, when you have depressive mood and a lot of symptoms, and you have a sharp break in your functioning and in your life.
If there's one real point that's kept coming up during the past hour, it's that depression, in virtually all its forms, can be helped. At long last, the biological and psychological camps of professionals are coming together, each bringing their special skills to the problem. And the winners are the public. Whether it's drug therapy, convulsive therapy, or psychotherapy, the ability for crisis intervention and long-term improvement is there. Finding it and getting to it is another matter. It's been estimated that 2% of the population is now under some sort of treatment for mental problems, but another 10% need it and aren't getting it, and 40% more could benefit from time to time from professional help. Our present system can't even handle the 10% who really need immediate help. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons. The profession is relatively new. Funds for community mental health care are tight and liable to get tighter. And we think we've found another reason, too. Up to very recently, the system has been geared in general to the well-to-do, the relatively small number of people who had both the time and the money to enter into fairly long-term psychotherapy or analysis. The poor or the black didn't have the time or money for access to mental health care. For years, they weren't even counted in mental health statistics. Today, that attitude is no longer tenable, and the time factor involved in treatment is being whittled away by new therapies. So the system is slowly changing to accommodate them the same way medicine is gradually changing to do it. But perhaps it's time for us all as a society to redefine what we want from our mental health professionals. During the past several years, many of us have been asking them to actualize us, to make us happy, not to cure our illnesses, but to cure our lives. And that they still can't do. Eternal happiness isn't prescribable. But they can now beat the old terrors of manic depression and clinical depression a good part of the time, and some other mental illnesses some of the time. Perhaps then it's also time to bring our expectations closer to the reality of what can be delivered, and to be thankful that the really sick people who have gone down into the shadowed valley of depression don't have to live there anymore. Thank you for being with us. This is David Prowett. Good night.
The Thin Edge series has been made possible by an underwriting grant from Bristol Myers Company.